Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7. Putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
So what's the sound of a poem, and how is it heard and captured by the ear? Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. Many read poetry in silence, the words spread out on a page, but it is really an oral tradition, shaping the words and sounds to capture the imagination of a thought or an emotion. Today, poet Gerry LaFemina will be featured during Salisbury Poetry Week on the campus of Salisbury University, and his latest release is The Story of Ash. It's been described as a collection of poems that reach from the tawdry to the sublime while exploring desire, love, and loss. He's also a longtime rock musician, fiction writer, essayist, and activist, and welcome to the program.
Don, thank you for having me.
So I want to start with this idea about poetry is the highest form of art. What do you mean by that?
Oh, it's a completely subjective,
of course,
a completely subjective statement. And but I first of all, I think poetry, first of all, is the only art that uses language fully. And language is a way of communicating more so than color, more so than music, more so than sculpture. And it is the one art form that allows us to use the malleability of language that simultaneously sets us on the same page. When I say tree, you know what I'm talking about. When I say seagull, you know what I'm talking about. As opposed to, what does a B flat seventh chord really mean? Now we can talk about symbolism, etc., but I'm a firm believer in that capacity to ground us in experience that poetry does, while simultaneously being engaged in the musicality of language, in the visual aspects of conjuring image in our imagination, that it brings together several of the other aspects of the other arts.
Let me ask you this, because words, as opposed to, say, pictures, right? They seem to not only engage one more, but fill out, make a roundness to the kinds of communication you're giving, as opposed to, say, for instance, pictures. And I'll give you an example. For instance, it's different to watch, say, a film that's been drawn from a movie, and then reading the novel, say, for example, which provides all this context, this shape to the meaning.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's important to recognize that, early on, the Greeks did not distinguish. Poetry was anything that was imaginative writing. Plato started as a poet, and really, the Socrates of the Platonic dialogues is a fictional character in many ways. These are kind of novelizations, and novels allow for backstory, allow for inner thought that perhaps movies have to attempt to do via picture and image and scoring, etc. I also think that language allows us to communicate over time. We are the only species that uses language. We now know that Neanderthals made art. We know that whale song and dolphin clicking has a complicated grammar. But language allows us to communicate through time. We understand that the experience of love that Sappho felt, that Basho felt, that Shakespeare felt, is very similar to the experience of love that you and I and everybody that's listening to this radio show feels.
Is it perhaps that words express our interaction with the outside world as opposed to seeing it?
Exactly. And not only that, words are meant to communicate that interaction. Words are a form of commerce, if you will. Even here, we're having this exchange through the power of language.
So you also talk about the ear of the poem. What do you mean by that?
I talk about the ear of the poem and the mouth of the poem.
Right, exactly.
I think of that famous poem by Robert Hayden, those winter Sundays in which he talks about the blue-black cold, and just the way your mouth has to say that. He's talking about the way his father worked in the weekday weather. Your mouth has to do things, and how he made the banked fires blaze. You say those things, and the way your mouth has to move up and down, those plosives of the B and then the hard cuss sound, those sounds and the way you have to move your mouth enact the labors of the father in that poem. And so I'm a firm believer in how language sounds both in our ears but also in our mouth that helps create the emotion of the poem.
Don't you think that poetry is essentially an oral tradition? That is, I've sat and read a poem, and it sits there as opposed to, say, being heard. For example, I remember years ago, Russell Lee Brown came to campus, and he sat on a little grassy knoll, and he would recite these poems, and you could hear, the images and the sound, as opposed to if I just sit there and read.
Yeah, I think that the best poems have to engage both the page and the stage, as it were. They have to want to be heard. Now, I think the other risk is that sometimes poets get so lost in making it sound good that they don't often say anything. That's the risk.
The overuse of alliteration, for example?
Yeah, it's very easy to make something that should be an effect be the overwhelming charge, the overwhelming driving force. And what happens is the poem then becomes a tongue twister in the case of alliteration.
So when you think about the syllables, you think about the sibilants and the dental Ts and so on. I assume that what you're trying to do is you're trying to fit those not only in terms of obviously meter and so on and so forth, but to fit the particular image.
And to fit the particular mood. The fact is, if you think about every curse, for instance, that we have, those great two-syllable curses that I can't say on the radio, but they're all spondies. You don't say them. They're both stress. You don't swallow one of those syllables. The sounds of words have a particular force, and their relationship to each other and the relationship to both the line of the poem and the sentence itself, the rhythm of those two things can create a lot of meaning. Now, poetry is a particularly interesting art because it's simultaneously visual. Where a line break happens, your eyes see that last word dangling there, and oral. I always tell students you read poems out loud because when you do, you're firing simultaneously two different areas of your brain, your visual cortex and your oral cortex. And so what's happening there is your brain is alive in ways that it isn't in other art forms sometimes.
So I want to turn to your inspiration. I read across a series of quotes that you got, but one is you said, "I'm interested in place and how we exist in it, personally, emotionally, and spiritually." What do you mean by that?
We're grounded, I think, in location. And what we choose to see from our outer landscape often is a reflection of our inner landscape. You know this. You're in a bad mood. It could be a beautiful spring day, and somebody goes, "Hey, it's gorgeous out." And you're like, "Oh, but the garbage men, messed up the garbage, and look, there's trash all over the place." Because landscape and how we perceive landscape is that nexus of what we feel and what we're experiencing. And I'm also a firm believer that we're not just the experience of our bodies, we're the experience of our souls. I don't necessarily mean that in a dogmatic way, but in a spiritual way. We exist in a place that is different than any other species on the planet. And that's because we have a kind of consciousness that recognizes something transcendental. And so the transcendental experience, or the phenomenological experience, if you want to get away from Thoreau, that acknowledgement that there's phenomena out there and that we experience it and we take it in. And as artists, I'm interested not just how we take it in, but then how we share it John Dewey, the great American philosopher, said art is the experience, and what he meant that the poem, the painting, that's artwork. Art is the experience of engaging that. And what the artist is trying to do is to create an artwork that allows you to have a similar experience that I had in the making of it.
You, by the way, you wrote a thing called Divinity, Pennsylvania, and I understand Pennsylvania. This town does not really exist, but nonetheless. But you said that you got this idea by driving. Explain that a little bit about.
Well, how about I read that poem?
Go ahead.
Why don't we start there
Sure.
so that we can do this? And I'll say this: Pennsylvania has great town names. They have a town named 76. They have a town named Laboratory. And so there is no town named Divinity, Pennsylvania, but it seemed to me the type of name that a town in Pennsylvania might have. Divinity, Pennsylvania. The whole county wears khaki and gray, even the one stunted tree waving from a field thatched with snow. The asphalt, too, blanched with road salt, and then appears the bright blue or green pipework of an oil well trapped in a small patch of barbed wire fencing, a reminder of the Commonwealth's crude history. Ramshackle houses with sighing barns and 2 cemeteries the last 2 miles. Some headstones have been worn thin as Eucharist wafers. Churches, low slung, so 1970s, steeples with their long moral compass needles scratching the sky's underbelly, thanks to the good graces of Quaker State. They worship a modern God, or perhaps more accurately, a postmodern one, the trinity of protagonists, that fractured narrative of 4 Gospels. Let this be enough to explain my lapses of faith. When the woman struck a Dalmatian with her minivan, I watched as she lifted it into the back like a wrestler, aware there'd be no miracle and no gospel but what's written in the marginalia. This first day of Lent, the good Catholics display their piety with a thumbprint of the divine pushed onto their foreheads, ash from the last flares of February. Last night, the luminous moon held its arms out and embraced its darker self. The stars, like pellets of ice, wet with light, and then glazed on the walking path, crackling like this paper. How will that woman break open the frozen soil with shovel and pick? How will she consecrate that ground, if not with her toil and tears? The world unbending and unbent, so she must smudge her forehead with dirt when she wipes her brow. The world relentless. The oil surveyors arrive with their machines and data, while the hungry raccoons shuffle off in search of their clawed deity among the stark underbrush.
So how did you take a long drive?
I was actually driving between 2 readings in Pennsylvania, and I literally passed 2 cemeteries within 2 miles. And I thought to myself, And then I realized that these were, church-related cemeteries in one way or another. And I passed this very 1970s style church, and of course I passed these oil wells, which Pennsylvania is littered with. And so I immediately started to play with the language of it, the crude oil history of Pennsylvania. I always loved that there's Quaker State is an oil company. I'm sure the Quakers love that. And so I started to play with that, and I never know where things are going to lead. I didn't see a woman hit a Dalmatian. She just appeared in the poem as I was drafting, which is often the case. But that idea of death and rebirth, of wanting to honor something, in this case a pet, and how capitalism and faith are so interwoven in this country right now in ways that are both potentially amazing and potentially terrifying.
When you write these poems, do you have some idea where they're going to go when you begin?
Never. Never. I start with a line. I start with a line and an image. The art of writing is the art out of myself. I don't have something I want to say. I want to learn what the triggering force is trying to teach me. I want to learn what externally that I saw, what that's connecting with inside of me, and I don't know yet, and that's why it's so interesting to me. It's a learning process, and then the art of revision is a way of clarifying. Ginsberg said, "First thought, best thought," and I always say, you know what? Most of the time I've ever kissed somebody, the first kiss was not the. You're doing that thing. You're like, which way do I turn? And you end up like kissing them above their left cheek, under the eye. First thought is often not the best thought. First thought is the unconsidered thought.
You talk about the idea that landscape is always a reflection of emotional landscape and or spiritual terrain that you're in.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Again, like I said before, what we perceive is often more a reflection of our internal sensibility than our external. We walk around with our obsessions. We can't help it. I don't need to write about my obsessions. They're going to appear whether I want them to or not. So when my son was my son is 26, but when he was 3, 4, 5, when his physical well-being was much more in my hands, my poems reflected that in a way they don't now. Not because I wish him harm, but because so much of it is now out of my control, so it's less an obsession of mine. But so my obsessions about the spirit, and they're significant, are always with me. And being out in the world, when we were driving earlier, we saw a turkey buzzard, swooping down, and Tara said something to the effect of it being a good that's like a heartening image, right? The turkey buzzard landing right in front of us, and for me, it is a heartening sign in many ways. Something has died, but something lives off that. There's that the so-called cycle of life. And what I'm always amazed by is how resilient landscape is. And I find it incredibly heartening. We've had plenty of storms recently, these nor'easters that have hit. And I'm looking at the magnolia in my front yard, and it's got these fuzzy buds that are waiting for spring, and yet the tree, that they haven't fallen off, they haven't, and I just think, that's hopeful to me, even in a time of sometimes what might be both emotional and spiritual desolation. One of my heroes is Ernest Shackleton, who was the Antarctic explorer who never made it to the South Pole, and in his most famous expedition failed. The ship got destroyed on the ice. The men at one point had to eat their dogs, their sled dogs. He managed to not only survive, but managed to keep all his men alive. And one of the ways he did it, by the way, was reading poetry. But that landscape of the ice, that landscape of the snow, how brutal it had to be, and yet how in that desolation they had to find consolation.
I want to turn to the story of Ash, and I think you may have described it as it's about lost dreams, and the phrase that jumped out at me is "America is a lost dream."
I want to say that America is an interesting time in the United States, and not so much America is the lost dream, but that we've managed to lose how to talk about the dream of America, and I think that's really sad. The American dream, as we think about it, is harder and harder to meet. Money is tighter and tighter. We see this in the teacher strikes that are happening right now across the country. And we see this in the talk of white working class voters voting for Trump, et cetera, et cetera. And the fact is this: our politicians, not only do they not talk straight, it's very easy to look for scapegoats. It's immigrants. It's cheap imports. It's It's automation. It's a combination of all sorts of factors. But one of the things I love about poetry is its ability to try to communicate the complicated. And one of the things I appreciate about poetry the most is when it's of two minds. I can love this country and criticize it, right? If one of my family members, if my son became an opioid addict, which fortunately he isn't, I wouldn't turn a blind eye to it, right? I would say, my son has a problem. I love my son. I want to face this problem with him and make him a better son, a healthier person. If I love my country, that idea of America, love it or leave it, how about love it and change it? Why, the ability, the capacity to talk about the lost dreams of young African American men being killed in this country by police officers, and the lost dreams of Appalachian coal miners or steel workers, and the lost dreams of immigrants, of DACA recipients being taken away from them. Those are all the same. And until we recognize that our shared humanity and our shared investment in this place called America is shared and shared equally, we're going to be in trouble. And what I love about language is that used well, and few politicians use it well, and by that I mean use it honestly, is that poetry is a place where we can talk about those things.
You have a title poem that you suggested you might read?
Sure. This is a poem called The Story of Ash. Rip Van Winkle territory. From the passenger seat, she reads aloud a story in which a bluegrass fiddler chooses a friend's farm for hospice, a house upstate. One, I bet, like any in Putnam County, picturesque properties as on a calendar hung in an office, as on a postcard we could write, "Wish you were here." The stone fences were negligees of snow. Old-growth limbs stoop even lower to listen. Fresh powder swirls like a child's pinwheel. She bends the book slightly, the way Sarah bends steel in those sculptures at the nearby museum. Massive, improbable curves that reveal some other untaught geometry, each proof of which is a lyric poem. Those sculptures also a memory, or else a metaphor for memory. Imagine waking a century later with a rusty rifle and useless currency. Perhaps then we're defined by what we refuse to forget. The staccato of her laughter, the pickup truck with its icy filigrees, the one chimney writing its long sentence of fumes into snowfall. The story of hardwood, the story of ash, of soot. It will never again be the story of oak or birch, the story of maple. What's it mean I've chosen this tale to tell? Heater blowing, the movement of the windshield wipers from margin to margin, the book she's reading, a subplot I almost forgot, the falling apart marriage between the friend and his wife while the musician swallows pain pills in the living room. An Amtrak passes us, parallel, Manhattan-bound, its passengers enmeshed in their own dramas. Someone's reading a novel about a couple driving in a snowstorm. Someone's anticipating his dinner in Chinatown. Someone's writing a postcard he bought at the station. Someone, no doubt, is thinking how hard it must be to bend the rails just so for the valley's extended curves. Sarah believes you discover how far the metal will bow and flex, and then it becomes an act of will, of technique. A year hence, this day will be distilled to its essentials. Her name and mine, the museum, the way the snow gathered in her hair, briefly, like lace. Because tomorrow a friend will die, backstage, after a gig. He'll put down his Les Paul, say something about it being so heavy, then say, "Oh, Christ." Massive coronary. That, as they say, will be that. Each mile is an act of will against nature, the way a trestle is, or a stone fence, or a house among the trees. In a different draft, any of these homes might be ours, although the wind has whipped up some, so they're harder to see, camouflaged in all this white and gray. Sarah says he looks for the story in the steel, and thus he's one of us. A year from this moment, she will no longer say she adores me, but right now the road curves ahead. Like any blank page, the snowy fields frightening, full of potential. It was the Chinese who first used ash to make ink.
In one sense, what I get from the poem is that there's a certain edge to life and its struggle, its defeats as well as its hopes.
Yeah, and those defeats and hopes are interwoven. They can't not be. And I think that's what we've forgotten in some ways about this country.
So you're not only a poet, you're a musician.
I am indeed.
I think I read a quote that says you think that everybody should at least rock out on a guitar, even if they can't play one.
Exactly. That's the only way. You know, I love the sound of a guitar. I love the feel of it. I am not a great guitar player. I'm the first to admit it, but I love it. I play every day. I'm a power chord playing. You know, Dave Davies and Joe Strummer are my heroes. But I love it. And what I love is that I do tons of literary events and people come out. And then I do a musical event and 3 times as many people come out. And the literary event will be free and the musical event they'll have to pay.
Something wrong with that?
It always strikes me as odd, but people are scared. People are scared of poetry in a way they're not scared of music. And for me, writing songs, playing music, it allows me, much like writing fiction when I write fiction or writing essays or even writing short one-act plays, which I've done, it just allows me to look at the malleability and plasticity of language in a different way. And for me, doing that brings me back to poetry in a new, to see it in a fresh way of what's possible.
We've been speaking with poet Gerry LaFemina, and he's featured this weekend, the Salisbury Poetry Week. You're on the campus of Salisbury University. We appreciate you stopping by and chatting with us.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Production and audio engineering by Chris Frank. Hosted by Don Rush. For podcasts, visit delmarvapublicradio.net or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on Pack 14.